Hey guys, so at the start of my career, I spent a lot of time in tech startups. And a reason I focused on startups is I knew that you could receive a lot more of the financial upside as a reward for your contributions that helped to make that startup successful. So if you build your company yourself, you're obviously going to get all of the reward. Or you could also join another startup that has strong growth potential and then share the reward with others. Now, we all know how difficult it can be to get these startups up and running. But if you do succeed, you should then benefit from the profits that are generated by the company. Or you could benefit from the sale of the company in the future. Now, I've tried building my own startup a few times and failed twice. But like anyone who's ever tried to start a company before, you learn a huge amount of lessons from that experience. And they're lessons that you never really forget. And along with these efforts to try and build startups myself, I've also been a software developer in a number of tech startups that were in their earlier stages. The thing that always stood out to me from the very first startup I joined was around the process the founders used to decide how shares were going to be distributed between employees, but also what the founders received as well as any investors. The decisions and outcomes rarely made a lot of sense to me. They always seem to be based on a prediction or negotiation of the value of the role or the perceived potential value of the particular person that was joining. For instance, someone might be offered 3% equity when they join a startup that might have only been around for 12 months. And this company might not even have a working product yet. Well, if the founders each had 10%, 20%, or even 30%, they would need to have taken a lot more risk, and their contributions would need to be a lot more valuable than the employee who has 3% to justify that share distribution. Now, let's do a quick example. Let's imagine a first employee was offered 3%, two founders had 30% each, 15% was set aside for future hires, and then the remaining 22% was already allocated to investors. Right, okay. And now let's say the company is successful and it gets sold in 5 years' time. If someone joined after the first 12 months, it would mean that they have contributed for 80% of the time that the founders have. So now let's imagine that each person's contribution to the company was similar in value for making that company successful. The first employee would have done 4 years and both the founders would have done 5 years, which is 25% more in contribution for each of the founders. So it might be fair for them to receive a reward that is at least 25% larger. So starting from 3%, a 25% increase would be 3.75% and not 30%. Now, of course, this obviously ignores the risk factors for the minute. Now, employees can and do receive more shares over time. It wouldn't be very surprising in some cases that the employee does eventually accumulate 6% equity over the duration of their employment. But I've never really seen situations where the employee ends up with more equity than the founders, even though it is absolutely possible that the employee could have made the largest and most impactful contributions towards making the company a success. Now, some of you might be shrugging and disagreeing already. Maybe it's because the founders took the initiative to start the company, and they also took more risk in that first year to set the company up. The investors might not have ever joined if it wasn't for them. Now, of course, risk does absolutely need to be fairly rewarded, but this also needs to be balanced with the need to respect the value of the contributions that people are making. Contributions that could have been the main reason why the startup actually succeeded. And it's important to note that the employee can also be taking risk when they join an early stage company. They could be risking some of their time if they receive income that is below the market rate they could receive elsewhere. And of course, the shares also might never ever be worth anything. Now, the risk is likely reduced by some variable amount in the first 12 months, but it doesn't completely vanish the moment a startup receives investment or when it creates a minimum viable product. Risk is obviously a really important topic, so I'll likely make a video in the future about this that covers it properly. However, regardless of how risk is incorporated into the compensation, the real problem I was seeing was the lack of ongoing effort to meaningfully adjust the share structure based on the actual value that each and every person was providing with their own contributions, which should obviously also consider the founders' contributions and not just the employees. It was fairly common for startups to eventually adopt some form of performance-based reviews, but rarely would you ever see performance reviews on the founders, especially where other people could actually influence their compensation in the same way. And lots of things can happen along the journey of building a startup. Someone might become highly skilled in a really complex area that was extremely important for the business. Someone else might become really efficient at a number of skills and then be outperforming everyone else in the business, and could be someone that is always going above and beyond. And then another person might not even contribute for months at a time due to unforeseen family circumstances. The important point here is that you simply can't predict everything ahead of time. So you have to reflect on what actually happens if you want to have any chance of aligning the incentives with rewarding people based on the amount of contributions they have made and the overall impact of those contributions. If someone contributed their absolute best to a startup as an early stage employee, and this transformed the business, it was fairly unlikely that they were going to actually receive a fair amount of the total reward when compared to the founders or early stage investors. It always felt like a recurring problem that an employee's contributions were proportionally making someone else more wealthy and successful at the expense of their own contributions. So I was going to write about this problem and try to solve it, but as I started looking up online this topic area, I actually found a book from someone who was thinking about the exact same problems. Now, the book was called The Slicing Pie, which was written by Mike Moyer. And the book explores how you can solve the distribution of shares for a startup by accounting for the different contributions people make, and also whilst taking into account the risk involved in those contributions. Which means the distribution of shares for a startup became more focused on what had actually happened. Now, this is rather than using the more commonly adopted approach of being based on negotiation or a prediction of future value, and then performance reviews that only somewhat tweaked and increased the amount of shares that people received over time. Now, although this more common approach can be simple, it is nearly always inaccurate due to being based on predictions instead of exactly what happened. So it was a relief that I wasn't the only one who could see that there must be a better way of doing this. And at the time, if I was going to work on a new startup again, this was the kind of approach that I would use. Recording people's contributions and then distributing shares in the future using collective records of those contributions to work out a fairer split of the equity. Now, this approach should help with creating fairer outcomes, but also with better aligning the incentives for people to contribute as much as they want to, knowing that it's going to be rewarded more fairly. So the prediction and negotiation-based approach for distributing equity in a startup is simple, but inaccurate and broken. Founders are even incentivized to adopt that approach just because it benefits them over other people. Now, all I can say is this isn't the end of the journey for fixing startups and organizations more broadly. But having these experiences in startups myself and seeing some of the other ideas that other people had about how to fix those problems was a really, really important step for me as a foundation for me to think about how we could arrive at a better solution in the future. And we'll definitely get to that, but that'll be in an upcoming video. See you soon.